We are back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to continue talking about the weekend. A very eventful week for, I would say, the majority of the top NFC teams, because in this game, in this segment, it was no different. Talking about the Philadelphia Eagles, the Pennsylvania Classic, as I've heard it been called, went to Philadelphia this time around, as it usually does in Philadelphia, as they face the Pittsburgh Steelers. After this game in Philly, the Steelers now go to 0-11 since the last time they won in the city of Philadelphia. Yesterday, it was no different. Obviously, the Eagles won 27-13 and extended their winning streak to 10 games now, and are now tied for first in the NFC, in the entire NFC, the conference overall, with, like we just talked about, the Lions losing. It puts the Eagles equal with their record at 12-2. But on the other side of things for Pittsburgh, because they're also, in the playoff mix as well, it was always going to be, a long shot to win this game because of the injury to George Pickens and facing a very impressive Eagles team overall, but their defense as well was insane yesterday. And, with the loss, now the Steelers are 10-4 and are only one game ahead of the Ravens for the number one spot in the AFC North. And, of course, with this crazy schedule coming up for a few teams, 3 games over the next 11 days for the Steelers, for the Ravens, for the Texans, and the Chiefs. Now their next game that the Steelers are going to play is, of course, the Baltimore Ravens. A pretty much deciding game for the division, because if the Steelers win, they're going to win the North. But if the Ravens win, it opens up a huge door. The entire door is open for them to take the division because of how difficult the Steelers' end of schedule is, and the Ravens, it probably can't be as hard. I mean, I'd have to look, but I can't imagine it's as difficult as the Steelers, but I will give it a look here in just a second. But as we continue talking about this, it's kind of weird because the Steelers lost yesterday in pretty convincing fashion, but because of how all the other results, finished off, at the end of Sunday, the only good thing that came from yesterday for the Steelers was that they somehow secured a playoff spot, even though they lost to Philadelphia, because the loss to the Colts and the loss to the Dolphins meant that the Steelers could win or lose, and they'd still be in if those two teams lost. And the Broncos beat the Colts, and the Texans beat the Miami Dolphins, not only securing a playoff spot for the Texans with that win and the Colts loss, but also with both of those teams losing, the Steelers are also guaranteed to be in the playoffs. Now it's just a matter if they're going to be the 3, 4, or probably 5 seed. One of those 3 seeds is going to go to Pittsburgh. Probably not 4, probably 3 or 5, I would say, because Houston's obviously in there. But really the main story going into this game, obviously, was what we mostly talked about the week leading up into this game, with A.J. Brown, Jalen Hurts, Brandon Graham even as well, talking about their frustrations with the passing game and how it was being handled and things like that. It all got pretty messy and just all kind of blown out of proportion a little bit. I understand how it was blown out of proportion just from a standpoint that, it was only a 1-week thing, and now, you look at them and it looks like nothing ever happened. But also in the same breath, for something like that to just pop up randomly, it's like the last thing you need for a team that's 12-2, right? You know what I mean? Like, a team's doing so good and they're healthy, they have a pretty easy end of schedule, and the last thing you need is for them to kind of be fighting amongst each other. So that was kind of what raised some eyebrows in leading up into this game, but it all went like pretty much up into smoke, like we kind of predicted, right? Because this game was only going to go one of 2 ways, right? It was either going to be that the frustrations continued, that Jalen really wasn't throwing AJ the ball, and that those frustrations, those, antics were going to boil over again on the sideline or wherever, right, in yesterday's game. But that obviously didn't happen, and the other option happened, right? They were going to go off. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith were going to have a great game. Jalen was going to have a great game through the air, and it was going to look like nothing ever happened, and that's what we saw yesterday. And if you look at the numbers that Jalen and really A.J. Brown put up in particular, it was, a great day through the air for them. Jalen Hurts had 290 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and a tush-push touchdown, while also adding 45 rushing yards. And A.J. Brown having one of his better games in recent memory with 8 receptions, 1 touchdown, and 110 receiving yards. They were just too much for the Steelers because, you look at those numbers and you're thinking, like, the Steelers probably got destroyed. And they kind of did, but, they got so many weapons. And it's a case like that with them, with the Bills, and even the Lions a little bit on offense. But the Eagles just got so many things to worry about. And the Steelers really looked like they were just trying to not let Saquon destroy the game. And I think he had one of his lowest days through the ground in recent memory as well. I think he finished with like 60 something yards yesterday. So it was pretty clear that the Steelers wanted to stop Saquon and they were going to live with AJ or Devontae Smith having a pretty decent day, which they did. But it's all of that to say that that I don't think was so lopsided as it might have looked. Of course, the score looks like, they doubled the Steelers score, right? Obviously, but that was without George Pickens, right? And that's one of their best players, obviously, on offense, if not one of their best players, but definitely the most impactful player. The one that you can miss Najee, you can have Jaylen Warren, you can have maybe Calvin Austin not play, or maybe even Pat Freiermuth not play, and it might still look the same if George is out there. But once George goes down, as we saw yesterday, the entire thing just looked off. It looked like they really hadn't had any real offensive momentum going into this game, and it was a little bit worrying, to be honest, because I heard somebody say it today that pretty much summed it up perfectly, was that the Steelers without George really have nobody else to game plan around, right? There's nobody else that really kind of keeps you up at night thinking about like, oh, I got a game plan for this guy so he doesn't really wreck the game for us. Without George, they really don't have that kind of guy, right? Obviously, Najee Harris is a decent player. Jalen's a decent player. They're a decent, duo. Pat Freiermuth is having a pretty nice, season overall. But really after that, especially the wide receivers, nobody's really scaring you for you to go over there and like double them or, make sure they don't wreck the game. And it showed there was a lot of, just bad drives. They really struggled to get a first down there through the first couple possessions. And, the way the game started, I thought this was not going to go well, that the Steelers were probably going to lose by like 20 plus points. But at one point in the game, it got pretty close where the Eagles were up 17-3 with AJ and Devontae Smith up early, like I said. But then Pittsburgh kind of got a little bit of a lifeline towards the end of the first half with a touchdown by Pat Freiermuth that brought the score to 17-10, right? And then the Steelers managed to get a last, second field goal there to end the first half. So, despite how lopsided it looked, it was only a 4-point game in the first half. And then, to start the second half, the Eagles only got a field goal. So now it's 20-13, right? The Eagles, for a couple possessions, haven't really gotten anything going. They've punted, they've hit a field goal, not that big of a deal because it's only still a one-score game. And it felt like a little bit to me while I was watching the game that the Steelers were about to potentially turn the corner if, they scored on this drive or they got some sort of points. They could have at least kept that momentum going. But to start that drive after the Eagles made it 20-13, the Steelers hit a pretty nice flea flicker, and it got them like almost 40 yards. They hit another play to Calvin Austin that got them nearly like another 15 to 16 yards as well. So now the Steelers are sitting at the Philadelphia 26. You're thinking at least a field goal should be okay, right? But after a toss play, Najee Harris just drops the ball, he fumbles, and the Eagles pick it up and they recover it. So at that point, I'm thinking this was the drive for the Steelers, right? They were either going to get a touchdown and really make it a game. A field goal kind of kept them in it. Or, the worst case scenario was they turned the ball over. And, of course, like things always, turn out, the Eagles took that turnover, they got the ball back, and they scored a touchdown, now making it 27-13. And the Steelers punted again one more time, and then the Eagles closed the game out with a 10-minute and 21-play drive through Saquon mostly to close out the game. And it's nothing to take away from the Eagles because their defense was amazing. Their defensive line really just completely erased anything the Steelers were trying to do in the running game. They were getting pressure on Russell Wilson. They were playing two high safeties all day. So not only do they have nobody to worry about, in case of doubling, now they really can just patrol everything because they know no one's getting back there. They really don't believe any of the wide receivers can beat their corners one-on-one. So now they have two guys sitting back there, really not allowing anything to go over their heads. And they were forcing the Steelers to kind of methodically put together long drives to beat them and see if they could actually beat them without George Pickens. And obviously, that didn't turn out as the Steelers would have hoped. They looked outmatched, outmuscled, and despite all of that, they had their moment there with that drive. But unfortunately, Najee Harris fumbled, and that just talks about the theme, the narrative with this Steelers team, right? The Eagles are a great team. They're playing some of the best football of the season so far because they are healthy and they have talented players, so they're playing really good. But for the Steelers, with or without George Pickens, their theme, their narrative is that they can't have turnovers. They can't hurt themselves. They could potentially put together some bad drives like they did yesterday, but they have a really good defense that they're fortunate enough that they, can get the ball back for them. They could stop teams repeatedly more often than not, but you can't have turnovers hurting yourself. And in the games where, Russell Wilson might throw an interception or he fumbles like he did against Cleveland, it makes it extremely tougher for this team to win. And the margin of error is so small. Even with George Pickens there, it's so small. And then when you take George out of it, there's almost no margin of error, right? And the Steelers, were doing everything possible to win this game, with TJ Watt forcing Jalen Hurts to fumble, recovering that one. Cooper DeJean fumbling, the Steelers recovering that one. They weren't able to capitalize on it. And on top of that, they hurt themselves with the turnover. So this Steelers team, I do believe, is good if they can play the way that they want to play, right? Clean football, running the ball, taking little errors, little risks, and, living and dying by that. We've seen them win games by only field goals. We've seen them win games by like 20 or at least multiple scores if they play clean, right? If they're not turning the ball over, they have a chance. I truly believe that, and I think we saw it yesterday. But, we saw that turnover, and I'm not saying if the game's 2020, the Steelers definitely win, but you don't really know what's going to happen at that point, right? The Eagles are definitely a more talented team, and I would say they're playing better right now. But, the turnover definitely was a huge point in the game. And for them to still kind of be that close without George, I think, there is more to this team than I think a lot of people will give them credit, the day after. So, it was a good game regardless, but the Eagles were definitely deserved winners at the end of the day. So, with that being said, we're going to move on to another topic. And speaking about deserved winners, we're going to go to Sunday Night Football and talk about the Packers really handling the Seattle Seahawks on the road. But we're also going to touch on a much larger topic with the Seahawks and looking at the injury to Geno Smith and whether or not they're in danger of missing the playoffs altogether. That is coming up right after this break.
Looking for